On March 22, 1421, Thomas of Lancaster, Duke of Clarence and brother to King Henry V of England, made a decision so catastrophically stupid that it would cost him his life, destroy his army, and hand England's enemies their first major victory in 6 years. Clarence commanded roughly 4,000 English soldiers, including 1,500 heavy cavalry, the same type of armoured knights who had crushed France at Agincourt just 6 years earlier. Facing him across the bridge at Baugé were approximately 5,000 French and Scottish troops, a combined force that English military doctrine said should be easily defeated by superior English cavalry and longbowmen. But Clarence had a problem. His longbowmen were miles behind, still marching to catch up. His officers urged him to wait for the archers to arrive, to use the tactical combination that had made England invincible. Clarence refused. He was the brother of the greatest warrior king in Europe. He commanded English knights in full plate armour who had never lost a cavalry battle, and he was facing an army that included Scots, whom the English viewed as barely civilized barbarians. Clarence ordered an immediate cavalry charge across the narrow bridge, without infantry support, without archers, without reconnaissance. What happened in the next 2 hours would be one of medieval warfare's most complete reversals, where English arrogance met Scottish rage, where the victors of Agincourt were butchered like animals, and where Clarence himself would die with his skull split open by a Scottish axe, his body so mutilated that it took hours to identify the corpse. To understand why the Battle of Baugé was so significant, you must understand the context of 1421. 6 years earlier, in October 1415, King Henry V of England had achieved what seemed impossible at Agincourt. His exhausted, starving army of 6,000 men, including 5,000 longbowmen, had destroyed a French force of at least 20,000 through superior tactics and French tactical incompetence. The English longbowmen had shot their arrows in such density that French cavalry charges were stopped cold, horses collapsing with multiple arrows in them, knights drowning in mud weighed down by their own armour. The French had lost between 7,000 and 10,000 men, including most of their military nobility. England lost perhaps 500. Agincourt traumatized France, destroyed their military confidence, and made Henry V seem invincible. By 1420, Henry had conquered Normandy, forced the Treaty of Troyes which made him heir to the French throne, and married Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. England was winning the 100 Years' War. France seemed finished. But France had an ally that the English had underestimated: Scotland. The old alliance between Scotland and France dated back to 1295, a mutual defence pact against their common enemy, England. When France was desperate after Agincourt, they called on Scotland for help. In 1419, the Dauphin Charles, the disinherited French prince fighting to reclaim his father's throne, sent urgent requests to Scotland for military aid. The Scots responded enthusiastically because they hated England with a generational passion. English invasions of Scotland had been brutal and constant. Scottish nobles remembered their relatives killed at Falkirk, Halidon Hill and Neville's Cross. They remembered William Wallace being hanged, drawn and quartered. They remembered English armies burning Scottish villages and massacring civilians. When France offered them a chance to kill Englishmen on French soil, thousands of Scottish soldiers volunteered. By 1421, roughly 6,000 to 7,000 Scots were fighting in France under the command of John Stuart, Earl of Buchan, and Archibald Douglas, Earl of Wigtown. These weren't professional soldiers. Many were Highland clansmen, fierce fighters who preferred hand-to-hand combat with axes and swords over the disciplined formations of conventional medieval warfare. The Scottish soldiers at Baugé were motivated by more than just military duty or alliance obligations. They were fighting a blood feud that had lasted for generations. Many of these men had personal reasons to hate the English. They had seen their villages burned during English raids into Scotland. They had relatives who died at English hands in the endless border wars. Some were younger sons of noble families who had no inheritance in Scotland and came to France seeking fortune and revenge in equal measure. Others were clan warriors following their chiefs, men who measured honor in combat and saw killing Englishmen as both duty and pleasure. The Scottish fighting style was notably different from conventional medieval warfare. While French and English knights emphasized the cavalry charge and formal battle tactics, Scottish soldiers were comfortable fighting on foot with brutal close-quarters weapons. They carried Lochaber axes, long-hafted weapons that could hook a knight off his horse or punch through plate armor with a spike on the reverse. They used war hammers and maces designed specifically to crack skulls inside helmets. They fought in loose formations that allowed individual combat skill to shine, rather than the rigid lines of professional armies. This made them unpredictable and terrifying opponents for English cavalry, who expected enemies to break and run when charged. In March 1421, the Duke of Clarence was campaigning in the Loire Valley, trying to suppress Dauphin Charles's forces. Clarence was Henry V's younger brother, ambitious and eager to prove himself as brilliant as the king. He had approximately 4,000 troops, including 1,500 heavy cavalry, and the rest infantry and archers. On March 21st, Clarence received intelligence that a French-Scottish force was nearby at the town of Baugé. The enemy army numbered roughly 5,000, including about 3,000 French troops under the Count of Aumale and 2,000 Scots under Buchan. Clarence decided to attack immediately. His officers pointed out that his army was divided, with the archers and much of the infantry still miles behind after a forced march. They urged waiting until morning when the full army could attack together. Clarence was dismissive. He reportedly said that the French and Scots would flee as soon as they saw English knights, that waiting would just let them escape, and that he would win glory by defeating them with cavalry alone. This was peak English arrogance, the assumption that heavy cavalry was invincible and that enemies who had been beaten before would always be beaten again. On the morning of March 22nd, Clarence led his 1,500 cavalry toward Baugé. The town sat on the north bank of the small Quesnon River, crossed by a narrow stone bridge. The French and Scottish forces were camped in and around the town, not expecting an English attack. When scouts reported English cavalry approaching, the Allied commanders made quick decisions. Instead of retreating, they decided to fight. The Scots in particular were eager for battle. They formed up south of the bridge in mixed formations of infantry and dismounted men-at-arms. The French cavalry positioned themselves to support. The terrain favored defenders. The bridge was narrow, perhaps 10 feet wide, meaning English cavalry would have to cross in a tight column and couldn't deploy in their preferred wide-line formation. This should have warned Clarence that a cavalry charge was suicidal, but he was too confident to care. Clarence ordered the charge. 1,500 English knights in full plate armor on war horses thundered toward the bridge. The front ranks crossed and began forming up on the south side, trying to organize into battle lines. But they were doing this under pressure, with limited space, facing an enemy that wasn't running away. The Scottish infantry held firm. When enough English cavalry had crossed to make attacking feasible, the Scots charged. What followed was not a cavalry battle, but a brutal infantry melee where Scottish and French soldiers pulled English knights from their horses and killed them on the ground. The Scots fought with axes, hammers, and swords, weapons designed to crack plate armor. They targeted horses, crippling them and throwing riders. The narrow space prevented English cavalry from using their primary tactic of the massed charge. They were stuck in a traffic jam of armored men and horses, unable to maneuver, being pulled down and killed individually. The mechanics of how the Scots killed armored English cavalry reveal both the brutality and the tactical intelligence of medieval combat. When a Scottish warrior with a Lochaber axe approached a mounted English knight, he didn't swing at the armor-protected torso. He hooked the axe blade behind the knight's leg or neck and pulled, using leverage to drag the knight off balance or directly off the horse. Once a knight was on the ground in full plate armor weighing 60 to 80 pounds, he was extremely vulnerable. He couldn't get up quickly without assistance. The Scots would surround a fallen knight, and while one man held him down or pinned him with a spear, others would use warhammers or mace spikes to strike at weak points in the armor: the visor slots in the helmet, the gaps at armpits and groin, the backs of knees. A well-placed hammer blow to the helmet could cause massive head trauma even without penetrating the steel. The Scots also targeted horses systematically because a warhorse cost more than most soldiers earned in a year, and killing it instantly reduced an elite cavalry unit to a helpless man in heavy armor. Contemporary accounts describe the sounds of Baugé as nightmarish, the screaming of wounded horses, The metallic clanging of weapons on armor, the shouting in Scots Gaelic and French and English, and the wet, crunching sounds of axes splitting helmets and skulls. This was not glorious warfare. This was industrial-scale butchery in a confined space where English numerical advantages meant nothing, and their armor became a cage they couldn't escape. The Duke of Clarence, fighting at the front, because he believed a commander should lead, became a target. Scottish warriors recognized him by his rich armor and targeted him specifically. Contemporary chronicles describe Clarence being surrounded, his horse being killed or crippled, and him being pulled to the ground. The exact details of his death vary by source, but the most consistent account is that he was struck in the head with an axe or war hammer that split his helmet and skull. Other Scots joined in, stabbing and hacking at the fallen Duke. When they pulled off his helmet to loot the body, they found his face so destroyed by the head wound that identification required checking his armor and personal items. The brother of the King of England, second in line to the throne, died in the mud of a French riverbank, killed by Scottish soldiers he had considered beneath him. With Clarence dead and English cavalry trapped in the killing ground south of the bridge, the battle became a massacre. English knights who tried to retreat back across the bridge found it blocked by more English trying to advance. Those who stayed to fight were overwhelmed by superior numbers in close combat, where armor was less protective. The Scots showed no mercy, killing wounded English and looting bodies even while fighting continued. French cavalry joined the attack, hitting English flanks. Within 2 hours, the English force was destroyed. Approximately 1,500 to 2,000 English soldiers died, including Clarence and dozens of other nobles and knights. Another 1,000 were captured for ransom, including the Earl of Somerset and Lord Roos. Only a few hundred English escaped. Scottish and French casualties were probably 300 to 500, mostly men wounded in the close quarters fighting. The battlefield was littered with English corpses in expensive armor, their bodies stripped and mutilated, their horses dead beside them. The immediate aftermath of Baugé revealed the complete scale of English disaster. The field south of the bridge was carpeted with dead English knights, their expensive plate armor stripped from corpses by Scottish and French soldiers who had just become wealthy beyond their dreams. A single set of quality plate armor could be sold for more than a craftsman earned in 5 years. The horses alone represented a fortune. Scottish soldiers reportedly sang victory songs while looting, celebrating not just a military triumph, but personal revenge for generations of English oppression. The body of the Duke of Clarence was eventually recovered and prepared for transport back to England, but the condition of the corpse became a matter of hushed horror in contemporary accounts. The blow that killed him had caved in the front of his skull. His face was barely recognizable. His body showed multiple stab wounds from Scottish daggers, finding the gaps in his armor as he lay dying or already dead. English survivors who made it back to their lines described the battle in terms usually reserved for massacres rather than military engagements. They spoke of Scots fighting like demons, laughing while they killed, showing no fear of death. The psychological impact on English forces was profound because Baugé demonstrated that without longbowmen, English heavy cavalry could be destroyed by determined infantry with the right weapons and terrain. The aura of invincibility created at Agincourt was shattered in 2 hours at a river crossing no one had heard of. The strategic consequences of Baugé were immediate. England had lost the king's brother, the second most important military commander in France, along with a significant portion of its military leadership in a single afternoon. King Henry V, campaigning elsewhere, was reportedly devastated when he heard the news. The myth of English invincibility, created at Agincourt, was shattered. The French and Scottish forces were emboldened, proof that English knights could be beaten if caught without their longbowmen and in unfavorable terrain. The Dauphin Charles used the victory as propaganda, claiming divine favor had returned to France. Scottish soldiers became highly valued as shock troops in French service, and thousands more Scots would come to France in the following years. The victory at Baugé transformed the strategic importance of the old alliance and changed how Scottish soldiers were employed in French service. After March 1421, French commanders actively sought Scottish troops for difficult assaults and defensive positions where fierce hand-to-hand fighting was expected. The Scots had proven they would hold ground against English cavalry, something French troops had repeatedly failed to do since Agincourt. Scottish commanders like Buchan were given positions of authority in the French military hierarchy, leading not just Scottish contingents, but French troops as well. Over the next several years, the Scottish presence in France would grow to perhaps 10,000 men, representing a significant portion of Scotland's military-age male population. These soldiers sent money back to Scotland, enriching their families and clans, creating an economic incentive for continued military service in France. The old alliance, which had been a diplomatic treaty, became a living military partnership where Scottish blood purchased French gold, and both nations benefited from fighting their common English enemy. Towns across Scotland celebrated Baugé with festivals and songs, some of which survived in oral tradition for centuries. The battle became proof that Scots were not the inferior barbarian warriors English propaganda claimed, but skilled fighters who could defeat England's finest when the tactical situation was right. But Baugé didn't change the outcome of the 100 Years' War. Henry V continued campaigning and winning. He died in 1422, not from battle but from dysentery, the inglorious killer of medieval armies. His infant son Henry VI inherited both the English and French thrones, but the long minority and weak rule eventually led to English defeats and the loss of all French territories, except Calais. Baugé was a tactical victory that provided temporary hope, but couldn't overcome England's superior resources and French internal divisions. Within decades, the 100 Years' War would end with French victory, but that victory owed more to Joan of Arc's inspiration and French artillery than to the Scottish axes at Baugé. The human cost of Baugé, like all medieval battles, was borne primarily by common soldiers whose names we don't know. The 1,500 to 2,000 English dead included not just nobles, but ordinary men-at-arms, archers who arrived too late, and support personnel killed in the rout. The Scottish and French casualties of 300 to 500 were men who died in the brutal hand-to-hand fighting required to pull down armoured cavalry. These men were celebrated briefly, then forgotten, their sacrifice remembered only as numbers in chronicles written by literate nobles. The Battle of Baugé stands as a lesson in the dangers of arrogance and the importance of combined arms tactics. Clarence had the tactical doctrine of Agincourt available to him. Use longbowmen to disrupt enemy formations, then charge with cavalry. He ignored it because he believed English cavalry alone was sufficient. His error cost him his life and destroyed his army. The Scots and French won because they recognized the terrain advantages, held firm against the charge, and fought with weapons suited to close combat against armored opponents. It was not a miracle or divine intervention. It was tactics and determination defeating arrogance and overconfidence. On March 22, 1421, Scottish Highlanders and French soldiers hacked 5,000 Englishmen to pieces because the English commander was too proud to wait for his archers and too arrogant to respect his enemies.